It is the dead of night. September 1759. A fleet of flat-bottomed boats glides silently down the black waters of the St. Lawrence River. Inside them sit thousands of British soldiers, clutching their muskets, forbidden to speak above a whisper. Above them loom sheer 200-foot cliffs. At the top of those cliffs sits the impregnable French fortress of Quebec, the heart of New France. For months, the British Army has battered itself against these defenses. And for months, they have failed. Winter is coming. In a matter of weeks, the river will freeze, crushing the British ships and forcing a humiliating retreat. The campaign is essentially over. The French have won, or so it seems, because in the leading boat sits a sickly, desperate 32-year-old British general named James Wolfe, and he is about to gamble his life, his army, and the fate of a continent on a goat path. Within 24 hours, the map of North America will be permanently redrawn in a battle that lasts exactly 15 minutes. 2 empires will clash, 2 brilliant generals will fall, and an entire civilization will be lost. The army that shouldn't have won did, and changed the world forever. To understand how 2 global superpowers found themselves locked in a death match on a farmer's field in North America, we have to look at the broader canvas of the 7 Years' War. It was the mid-18th century, and Britain and France were fighting the first truly global conflict. They clashed in the forests of Germany, on the shores of India, and across the oceans. But the ultimate prize, the jewel that both crowns coveted, was North America. For over a century, the continent had been awkwardly divided. The British controlled the densely populated, wealthy 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast. The French controlled a vast, sweeping crescent of territory stretching from the frozen mouth of the St. Lawrence River down through the Great Lakes all the way to Louisiana. New France was a fortress of the wilderness, built on the fur trade and alliances with indigenous nations. But the heart of this vast empire, the key that locked the door to the continent, was the city of Quebec. Quebec was practically unassailable. Perched atop a massive promontory called Cape Diamond, it was surrounded by steep cliffs and defended by heavily fortified walls. It was commanded by Lieutenant General Louis-Joseph de Montcalm. At 47 years old, Montcalm was a seasoned, brilliant tactician of the European tradition. He had spent the last several years humiliating British forces in the wilderness, using a combination of disciplined French regulars and lethal Canadian militia. Montcalm knew he didn't need to defeat the British in a pitched battle to win. He only needed to survive. He needed to hold Quebec until the bitter Canadian winter arrived to freeze out the invaders. Opposing him was Major General James Wolfe. If Montcalm was the seasoned veteran, Wolfe was the volatile prodigy. Tall, painfully thin, and plagued by chronic illness, Wolfe was a man driven by a ravenous hunger for military glory. He had been given command of the North American expedition by Prime Minister William Pitt, who saw past Wolfe's odd, neurotic exterior to the brilliant, aggressive commander beneath. But as the summer of 1759 dragged on, Wolfe's aggression was getting him nowhere. In late June, an enormous British armada carrying a quarter of the British Navy and thousands of soldiers had achieved a miraculous feat, navigating the treacherous, uncharted shoals of the St. Lawrence River. Thanks in large part to a young sailing master named James Cook, they dropped anchor before Quebec. And then, the siege stalled. Montcalm refused to take the bait. He entrenched his army along the Beauport shore, east of the city, daring Wolfe to attack. In late July, Wolfe did just that, launching a disastrous frontal assault that was easily repulsed by the French, costing the British hundreds of lives. Humiliated and physically deteriorating from a severe bout of dysentery, Wolfe resorted to a campaign of terror. He ordered his men to burn the farms, villages, and crops of the surrounding Canadian countryside, hoping to starve the city or goad Montcalm into leaving his defenses. Montcalm watched the smoke rise from the horizon, but he did not move. He wrote in his journal that if Wolfe attacked the fortifications, he would be crushed, and if he didn't, the winter would destroy him. By early September, the British High Command was in despair. The naval commanders warned Wolfe that they had to leave by the end of the month, or the ice would trap the fleet. Wolfe was bedridden, writing pessimistic letters home to his mother, convinced he was going to die a failure. But what came next shocked everyone. From his sickbed, Wolfe formulated a plan so reckless, so seemingly impossible, that even his own brigadiers thought he had lost his mind. He would not attack the heavily defended Beauport shore again. Instead, he would move his army upriver, past the guns of Quebec, and land at a tiny cove called the Anse aux Foulons. From there, a narrow, treacherous footpath wound its way up the 200-foot cliffs to the plateau above the city, a tract of farmland known as the Plains of Abraham. The French considered the cliffs impassable for an army. They had stationed only a token guard of sleepy militia at the top of the path. Wolfe's plan required perfect weather, perfect timing, and absolute silence. If the French discovered them mid-crossing, the British army would be slaughtered in their boats.
On the moonless night of September 12th, the operation begins. Wolfe, wrapped in a heavy cloak, sits in the leading boat. Legend has it that as they drift down the Black River, Wolfe softly recites Thomas Gray's poem, Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, lingering on the line, "The paths of glory lead but to the grave." Suddenly, a voice pierces the darkness from the shoreline. Qui vive? Who goes there? It is a French sentry. The entire British operation hangs by a thread. If the sentry fires, the alarm is raised, and the invasion is over. But a quick-thinking Scottish officer in the boat, who speaks fluent French, calls back into the darkness. "France, and long live the King!" He tells the sentry they are a provision convoy slipping past the British blockade. The sentry hesitates, then waves them through in the dark. The bluff has worked. The boats grind against the gravel of the Anse aux Foulons. A vanguard of Scottish Highlanders, the toughest shock troops in the British Army, leap ashore, slinging their muskets over their backs. They begin to pull themselves up the nearly vertical cliff face, using roots and branches for handholds. They reach the top, quickly overpower the stunned French guards, and secure the path. By the time the sun begins to rise on the morning of September 13th, the impossible has happened. Nearly 4,000 highly disciplined British regular soldiers have scaled the cliffs. Wolfe arrays them in a battle line across the Plains of Abraham, scarcely a mile from the walls of Quebec. Inside the city, Montcalm wakes to the news and refuses to believe it. He rides to the edge of the fortifications, looks through his spyglass, and is confronted with his worst nightmare. A sea of red coats stands between his fortress and its supply lines. The trap he had so carefully laid for Wolfe all summer has been completely bypassed in a single night. This is the turning point. This is the moment where history holds its breath. Montcalm now faces a critical decision. He is safe behind the walls of Quebec. He has thousands of elite troops, and a highly mobile reserve force commanded by Colonel Bougainville is just a few miles behind the British position. If Montcalm simply waits, Wolfe will be trapped between the city walls, an incoming winter, and Bougainville's reinforcements. But Montcalm does not wait. Whether driven by the pride of an aristocrat, the shock of the moment, or the terrifying realization that the British might bring up heavy artillery to breach the walls, Montcalm makes a fatal gamble of his own. He orders his army out of the fortress. He will meet Wolfe on the open field. By 9 a.m., the French army marches out of the gates. It is a mixed force, pristine, white-coated French regulars marching alongside colonial militia and indigenous allies. The militia immediately fans out into the woods and brush on the flanks, adopting their traditional guerrilla tactics, sniping at the British lines. Wolfe, wearing a bright new uniform that makes him an obvious target, strides up and down his lines, ignoring the sniper fire that is already dropping his men. He gives a strict order. No man is to fire until the enemy is within 40 yards. To ensure a devastating volley, Wolfe orders his men to load their muskets with 2 lead balls instead of 1. The British form a line that stretches across the plains. Because he lacks the numbers to form the traditional 3-rank deep formation, Wolfe stretches his men out in a line only 2 ranks deep, a thin red line that will become legendary in British military history. At 10 a.m., Montcalm orders the advance. Drums roll. The French regulars march forward, But as they move across the uneven, brush-covered ground, their formation begins to lose its shape. The militia, unaccustomed to the rigid discipline of European line battles, fire too early and drop to the ground to reload, further disrupting the ranks of the advancing regulars. The French loose a ragged volley at 130 yards. British soldiers fall, but the red line does not break. The discipline is absolute. The British stand like statues, their muskets shouldered, watching the white coats get closer and closer and closer. 80 yards, 60 yards. The tension on the field is unbearable. At exactly 40 yards, the British officers raise their swords. Present! Thousands of muskets are leveled. Fire! The resulting sound is described by survivors as a single, deafening cannon shot. The British double-shotted volley tears into the French ranks with unimaginable destructive force. Hundreds of French soldiers are instantly killed or mutilated. The smoke has barely cleared when the British step forward, fire a devastating second volley, and then draw their swords and affix their bayonets. The Highlanders draw their broadswords, scream a terrifying battle cry, and charge into the shattered French lines. The entire engagement, from the moment the French fired their first shot to the moment their lines broke and routed back toward the city walls, lasts just 15 minutes. In a quarter of an hour, the fate of a continent is sealed. But the battlefield demands a heavy toll for this victory. In the opening moments of the volley, James Wolfe is struck in the wrist. He wraps a handkerchief around it and keeps leading. Minutes later, a bullet strikes him in the stomach. Finally, a third musket ball hits him square in the chest. He collapses to the ground and is carried to the rear. As he lies dying, a soldier shouts, "They run! See how they run!" Wolfe struggles to open his eyes and asks, "Who runs?" Told that the French are retreating, Wolfe gives his final orders to cut off their escape, turns on his side, and whispers, "Now God be praised, I will die in peace." Across the field, tragedy mirrors tragedy. Louis-Joseph de Montcalm, trying to rally his fleeing men, is struck in the abdomen by grape shot from a British cannon. Supported by 2 soldiers, he rides his horse back through the gates of Quebec. When a panicked woman sees the blood pouring from his wounds and cries out, Montcalm tips his hat to her and replies, "It is nothing, madam. Do not weep for me." He is told by his surgeon that his wounds are mortal. "So much the better," Montcalm replies. "I am happy that I shall not live to see the surrender of Quebec." He dies the next morning. The Battle of the Plains of Abraham was relatively small in terms of numbers, but its shockwaves reshaped the modern world. Without Quebec, New France crumbled. The following year, Montreal fell, and the French Empire in North America was permanently erased from the map. Great Britain emerged as the unchallenged hegemon of the continent. Yet, history is rarely so simple, and victories often carry the seeds of future defeats. By removing the French threat from the northern borders, the British inadvertently freed their 13 American colonies from the need for British protection. Furthermore, to pay for this massive global war, Britain began levying heavy taxes on those very colonies. Just 17 years after Wolfe and Montcalm bled into the soil of Quebec, the American colonies would declare their independence, citing those taxes as their justification. The British won a continent on the Plains of Abraham, only to lose the most valuable piece of it a generation later. The echoes of that desperate morning climb, of that 15-minute duel, would shape the next 500 years of history. It is a stark reminder that history is not just made by the slow grind of geography or economics, but by human beings making impossible choices in the dark, betting their lives on a single, fragile moment. If you enjoy stories like this, where the turning points of empires hang by a thread, subscribe for more forgotten chapters of history.